does it mean to have an ideal Christian family? Today, we're going to find out. I'm Leah Carey, intimacy and relationship coach, and we're here to talk about the good, the bad, and the downright terrible advice given by Dear Abby. Do you swear by Dear Abby or at Dear Abby? Let's get into it. A Mind of My Own writes, Dear Abby, I've been seeing Randy for more than a year, and I can envision us sharing the rest of our lives together. I am an atheist, and Randy is a Christian. I have no problem with religion as long as it isn't being forced on me. Randy wants an ideal Christian family where he raises his children on his terms and with his religious views. I don't feel children should be forced into something from birth. Again, I have no problem with Randy's or his family's beliefs. I just don't want them impressed on my children's young minds. What can we do? Abby responds, Dear Mind of Your Own, you can part friends and agree to disagree. If Randy wants an ideal Christian family in which he raises his children on his terms and with his religious beliefs, there will be no compromise. So for a change, today I actually agree with Abby, but I think that there's a whole lot more to be said here, and so I want to dive a little deeper. When someone talks about an ideal Christian family, you can be pretty sure that they're not talking about just going to church once a week. You can be pretty sure that what they're talking about is having the church involved in many, if not all, aspects of their life. And children who are brought up in that faith are not just taught the rituals and the mythology. They're taught an entire way of believing who they should be, how they should behave, and what their responsibilities are in the world. Now, this is true of any religion, but it's especially true in evangelical Christianity. And those are the people who you're likely to hear talking about the ideal Christian family. And unfortunately, children who are brought up in this church, if they leave the church, it's not just leaving behind all of the scripture. They also have to learn how to leave behind all of these beliefs about who they are and who owns their body. This is purity culture. Now, you've probably heard me talk about purity culture before, and there's a reason for that. I talk about it a lot because it is so incredibly harmful, and so many people have been harmed by it. If you go back and listen to the archives of Good Girls Talk About Sex, you will hear so many women talking about the deep hurt, the deep confusion that they've experienced as a result of purity culture. This also happens to be a particular interest of mine in terms of coaching clients. I did not grow up in purity culture myself, but the type of abuse that I experienced left me with many of the same after effects that purity culture survivors have. And there's a reason for that. It is called high demand environments, or also known as high control environments. These are homes, childhood homes, that have very similar characteristics, even though they might look a little different in practice. So, purity culture is a high control, high demand environment. A home with narcissistic abuse, like the one that I grew up in. It could include cults and other types of environments where a child grows up without any sense of autonomy, where the child doesn't get to make choices for him or herself because the environment or the person who has control is making all of those choices for you. So I'll give you an example from my childhood. When I was about 10 or 11, my dad started telling me first that nobody would be attracted to me, but also that if anybody did show interest in me, he was going to break their kneecaps. And he was going to lock me in my room until I was 30. What that taught me was it was not safe to be interested in anybody because I would get in trouble, but also that if I demonstrated interest in anybody or they demonstrated interest in me, that I was potentially putting them in physical danger. Now, you can say, sure, he was making a joke, but it was a joke that was made so frequently, like practically every day, that it ceased to be a joke and sounded very much like a real threat. So, into my early 20s, I was terrified to let anybody know that I was interested in them. And as I'm saying this, I'm actually realizing that this is also potentially why I trained myself to not realize when people were interested in me, because that potentially put them in danger as well. My father has been dead for 25 years, and yet his voice is still so loud because he was the person who was in control of my high control environment, my high demand childhood. There was a huge demand on me to believe that I was who he told me I was, to never have a thought that differed from any thought that he had, and to show up in the world as the perfect representation of him rather than of myself. So if you hear somebody talking about something like the ideal Christian family, what they're probably talking about is purity culture. And purity culture is a high demand environment because children, from the time that they can walk and talk, are being taught that they are only allowed to have certain desires. They can only desire things that are heterosexual, monogamous, married, and that nothing happens before marriage, including kissing, including even holding hands. So you don't ever get to actually know the person who you're going to spend the rest of your life with, because also divorce is a sin against God. You have to walk into that marriage missing a huge piece of information about what your life will be like. And I would suggest that how somebody treats you in the bedroom is just as much a predictor of the partner that they're going to be long term as any other part of your courtship, because that is when we're at our most raw and most vulnerable. If somebody rejects you in the bedroom, that is not a good sign for long-term happiness. And yet, people who grow up in purity culture are not allowed to have those experiences. There are innumerable stories from people who grew up in purity culture, took on this idea that we should not kiss, we should not do anything before marriage, and they have very short courtships because they don't want to be tempted for any longer than is necessary. They get married very young, and then on their wedding night, when they're finally allowed to do the deed, it's awful. And that begins an entire lifetime of bad sexual experiences because the first time was terrible. And so they believe that that is the way it's always going to be. And this is more than just your average first time awkwardness. This is going for it so quickly that there's absolutely no time for the woman to become lubricated. This is bypassing any type of foreplay because we just want to get to the deed. There are so many things that can go so deeply wrong. There's also a fairly high likelihood of a man not being able to at the right time or at all because there's so much pressure put on it. Similarly, there's a very high likelihood that the woman is not going to experience a pinnacle of pleasure, shall we say, but they have no other frame of reference for what sex is. And so they believe that this is it. And the level of physical pain that can happen for women can be so extreme that it puts them off of sex for life. This is why you hear the, stories of the older women who are like, I only had it just enough times to get pregnant, and telling stories of the one-eyed snake because it was so unpleasant. And also, let's remember that people who grow up in this culture do not get any type of education. So they also have a ton of misinformation, downright wrong information that has been given to them by the church and or by their peers. Even worse, little girls are taught that they are responsible for the thoughts and actions of little boys. So you're not allowed to wear anything that shows your shoulders, because then if a boy looks at you and has impure thoughts, that's your fault. You have, in this parlance, caused your brother to stumble. So young girls, teenage women, don't have the opportunity to experience who they are. And there are lots of people who grow up inside cultures that have clothing norms or behavior norms, and that's fine. That is a culture. But when you are taught that the only way to be is this one culture, or you're going to go to hell and burn for all eternity, that is a very different level of coercion. So what happens when somebody is finally able to leave a high demand or high control environment? Very often, they are able to leave behind the community and the scriptures and all of those things. And yet, all of the teachings of purity culture and all of the teachings about how their body is not their own linger. That's why I end up having a lot of them in my practice as clients. Very frequently, I see men who have been told that they are addicts of either copulation or corn. And I have women who come to me not understanding why they're unable to pursue the desires that they've been dreaming about for years or decades even, why they sabotage themselves. There's also the people who come and say, I think that there's something missing, and I'm kind of interested in people for a non-heterosexual experience. And yet that is so deeply terrifying that they need a lot of hand-holding to get to the place of being able to do it. And once again, I point to myself. I was in my 40s before I started to let go of those old beliefs about who owned my body. In my mind, my father owned my body even after he was dead. My father controlled everything about my dating life, my romantic life, my relationships, which basically meant I didn't have any. And the ones that I did have tended toward the abusive because that was all I had ever known. My father created a belief in me that I was only really good enough for an abusive relationship. And so when they came along, I thought, well, okay, I guess this is what I'm supposed to do, even though I was miserable. I've worked with one couple who had exactly the experience I was talking about a few minutes ago, where the wedding night experience was extremely painful. She had never had any activity down there before. She was not lubricated well enough. And ultimately, she probably had some issues with, needing to stretch out a little bit. And so that wedding night was excruciating for her. And her husband loved her so much that he felt absolutely devastated that he had hurt her. And that began a 20-year relationship where intimacy was incredibly fraught for both of them because she was afraid of being hurt and he was afraid and felt guilty for hurting her. That is not a recipe for a happy or healthy intimate experience. Add on top of that they weren't talking about what they wanted because they never learned that you were allowed to do that. All they knew was that you were supposed to do missionary, and that was it. So our work together had a lot to do with untangling what is it that you want and how can we help you get it without tripping over all of those old fears about how much it's going to hurt and whether you're hurting your spouse. We did exercises around talking with each other about what you really desire from the smallest things, because you can't jump all the way from 0 to 60. You've got to start at 0 to 1. And so you don't right away start with, here are all the fantasies I have about what we can do in bed, but instead, like, put out your arm. How would you like your arm to be touched? What would feel good? Would you like a hand massage? Would you like just some gentle stroking? Would you like some scratching? Like, allowing people to actually experience their own desire and speak it out loud and know that they are not going to get in trouble or be laughed at or be rejected. Because those are all of the lessons that we learn in high demand, high control childhoods. So if I were working with Mind of My Own, my advice for her would be quite similar to Abby's, which is don't marry this guy. I would want to talk with her about what are your deal breakers, because it sounds like one of your deal breakers is that your children will be allowed to grow up without a lot of religious dogma and then make their own choices. So one of your deal breakers is probably to choose somebody who wants that same thing. And then you structure your dating life around dating that person and letting other people filter out, no matter how attractive they may be, and no matter how much you be drawn to them, let them go so that there's room for the person who actually matches your desires and your deal breakers. Now, more frequently, I end up working with the children that would come from a union between Mind of My Own and Randy if they were to go forward with it. And those children come to me saying, why can't I do the things that I see all of my friends doing? Why can't I have the adventures? Why can't I have the fun? Why am I so scared? Why do I feel like my body isn't my own? And so with them, I start with the very simple exercises. What do you want? And it is incredibly scary for a lot of people to even answer that very basic question, because it has come with so much baggage and so much drama before. We would spend time untangling all of those old beliefs about what you're allowed to want and why you're allowed to want it. We would talk about why they feel guilty for feeling good, because they learned that feeling good was a sin. And then we can get to the part of constructing a new reality where they get to explore their desires with somebody holding their hand to tell them it's okay, because you don't walk away from these beliefs in a couple of sessions. We can do this work and you can be feeling a lot better. And then you go out on a date and suddenly you're like, oh my God, I thought I got rid of all this stuff and here it is again. And so we go back and we learn the lessons again every time, over time, until eventually they have worked their way out of your system. So if all of this sort of rings a bell for you, maybe you grew up in a high demand childhood like a cult or narcissistic abuse or purity culture, and you're wondering how you can move through the things that are showing up for you, I want to tell you about my Freedom from Purity Culture offering. Now, I call it Freedom from Purity, but it is open to anybody who grew up in a high demand, high control childhood. And I set this up sort of like an audit. So you answer some questions about the beliefs that you grew up with, the lessons that you learned, and then you tell me what are the biggest stumbling blocks in your current relationship. It's just a form with 10 questions that you can go as deep as you want to. And I will take all of that information and I'll send you back a video that explains to you what I see and hear in your descriptions, what the things might be that are causing challenges for you, and then give you some ideas about how to move forward. All of this costs less than a single session, and you've got a video that you can watch as many times as you want and share with your partner so that you can begin breaking these bonds of purity culture and start truly enjoying your body for what it is, which is an instrument of pleasure. So the link for Freedom from Purity is in the description, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the question of the week, which is, have you ever had a relationship with somebody whose religious beliefs differ significantly from yours? How did it work out? Not every intra-religious couple is going to have huge problems, and I'd love to hear your stories. If this was helpful, I hope that you'll subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and return for weekly videos. And remember, you are worthy of love. And I'm going to help you get there, one conversation at a time.